Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 52, Hope. Pulling her scythe free from the stump, Ruby breathed a small sigh of relief at the lack of growling and straightened her back. They had been walking for nearly 2 hours, and judging by the distance tracker on her scroll, they had barely managed to cover a mile. Blake had definitely not been kidding when she'd said that the Grimm outside of the kingdom's walls were far more dangerous than any found in the Emerald Forest. From the moment they had entered the dead zone, it had been almost a constant wave of attacks from Grimm that Ruby couldn't help but notice were a lot smarter than the ones near Beacon. Where the Grimm of Emerald Forest and Forever Fall were almost always taken care of with relative ease, the ones they had been fighting for the past 2 hours definitely had not been. Instead of relentlessly attacking and relying on numbers, they actually seemed to strategize together. Beowulfs weren't knocking each other aside. Instead, they were surrounding and stopping them from focusing on one at a time. Creeps were constantly popping out of the ground to headbutt them, only to run away immediately and return minutes later. It was exceptionally annoying, but Ruby supposed that was what happened when the beasts weren't constantly being killed by students. Thankfully though, both Blake's and Redinch's experience in the wilderness, as well as their ability to sense when creeps were coming, was helping a lot when it came to warning them of attacks in advance.
"We should keep going before another pack arrives,"
Redincha said, sliding his scimitar back into its sheath on his hip.
"The tower is just up ahead." "And by just up ahead, I assume you mean another hour?"
Yang replied.
"Most likely."
The man shrugged and began to walk away, earning a groan from the girl.
"Welcome to life outside the kingdoms. Let's just keep going."
Ruby agreed with the huntsman and returned Crescent Rose to her back.
"The quicker we get there, the quicker we can rest for a bit." Yeah.
Yang yawned and shook her arms.
"I just didn't expect the Grimm out here to be so tough. You really grew up with this?"
Blake shook her head and accepted a new set of magazines from Weiss.
"The Grimm in Menagerie and Anima are a lot stronger."
Ruby could definitely see how that was the case. While the Grimm of Sanus were still not to be taken lightly, the continent itself was home to 2 fully developed kingdoms. And since both Vale and Vacuo took responsibility for aiding villages and exterminating Grimm, it did tend to be the safest of the 5 continents. Though, as strong as the Grimm might be in Atlas or Menagerie, they didn't compare to the Grimm that lived in the completely unexplored continent to the west of Solitas. Even Atlas military had been rebuffed when trying to approach.
"Well, at least we aren't fighting in the snow."
Weiss shrugged, also unfazed by how much stronger the Grimm were.
"I can actually let my aura down between fights out here."
"Hey!" Redincha called from ahead, half of his body obscured by grass.
"Let's go!" "We're coming,"
Ruby called, motioning with her head for the others to follow. Pulling out her map, as they left the road and walked into the overgrown part of the forest, she saw that they were approaching what Yang had marked as a recent Kamaitachi hotspot. Since there were none of them on patch, she had never actually fought one herself, but Beacon's bestiary said that they were extremely fast and agile, though it also labeled them as a low-threat Grimm to groups, preferring to pick off individuals instead. So trusting the information provided to her by past huntsmen, Ruby was pretty confident they wouldn't have any real issues getting to the tower, even if the hairs on the back of her neck did stand on end the second they stepped foot into the tall grass.
"We're being watched,"
she said to her team and sidled up to her girlfriend.
"Can you tell where from?" "No,"
Blake replied, her ears flicking back and forth to pick up any sound she could.
"Wherever they are, they're too quiet for me to hear." "All right,"
Ruby breathed, activating her aura and letting herself feel around them.
"Keep your ears peeled." "Will do."
Not wanting to distract her girlfriend while she tried to stay on the lookout for them, Ruby moved back to walk beside her sister. They hadn't really talked since their disagreement on how to handle the unknown Grimm, but the woman still gave her a smile as they fell into stride together.
"You okay?"
she asked the blonde, returning the smile.
"Seemed kinda worked up back there." "I'm good,"
she shrugged, fiddling with her gauntlets.
Still don't like that we're leaving Zealand to deal with whatever's trying to get in." "I don't like it either,"
Ruby admitted honestly.
"I wanted to stay and help too, but Blake's parents take priority right now." "I get that."
That blonde breathed and let her arms fall to the side.
"I just keep thinking about if that had been Patch, and nobody had done anything about the siren. The second that Grimm gets into the village, who knows what it'll do."
Ruby had always loved how much Yang cared for smaller communities. Despite being close to Vale, Patch was still a village that was constantly under attack by Grimm, and growing up there had shown them what was needed to survive such things. It was hard work, and required constant rebuilding, fortifications, and patrols. Everyone contributed to that, and Yang had always been eager to help with those things. When she was growing up, the woman would frequently help out at the farms or the stables. She was always willing to use her strength to help with construction, and Ruby knew the woman had loved every minute of keeping the people she loved safe.
Well, we know it lives out here somewhere.
Ruby smiled hopefully at her sister.
Hopefully, we can take care of it for them before it does anything.
Hopefully, Yang grumbled, retracting her gauntlets back into their bracelet form. Reaching out, Ruby put a hand on her sister's wrist and clicked the button to eject one of the shells. With a small pop, the shining red tube jumped into the air, and Yang's hand shot out to catch it with ease. It was something she had done when they were younger and Yang had first made the gauntlets. She remembered wasting hours laid on the grass just popping the shells out and letting her sister show off by catching it, and clearly Yang remembered too as a fond smile pulled at her lips.
We're not going to Ladash. Ah! Wise!
Ruby shouted and pulled out her scythe as she turned in time to see her partner fall to the ground. Attached to the heiress' back was a large, weasel-like beast. White armor ran down the spine of its pitch-black body and disappeared into a large, fluffy tail that Ruby knew was likely for balance. Its head was also plated, but 6 bright orange eyes peered out at them as the sharp fangs locked onto the back of White's neck, preventing the girl from escaping 4 bony limbs that were wrapped around her chest and pinned her arms to her side, each one covered with a vicious-looking scythe and tipped red.
Hold on!
Ruby called, seeing blue light shimmer around her friend as she struggled against the Yamashi blades.
We'll give it a dash. Ruby, look out!
Yang caught her a second she stepped forward as another shot out of a nearby tree. Giving her scythe a spin, she deflected a swipe from one of the curved legs that had been aimed at her throat and jumped backwards as the second Kamaitachi landed in the overgrowth in front of Weiss. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Yang pitch her arm back and toss the shell that had been ejected earlier at the creature, only for it to dart out of the way with impressive agility and disappear back into the trees.
Blake?
Ruby asked expectantly.
I still don't hear it,
the girl replied, arriving at her side with Saber.
The damn thing's too quiet. All right, I'll G-dash.
The second she attempted to take a step towards her partner again, she detected movement to her side, and moved her leg just in time as the scythe-like limb lashed out at her legs and carved a smooth crescent pattern in the grass. Before she could correct her stance, the beast had already vanished again.
It's protecting the other,
Saber noted, and pulled out a flintlock from his holster and pointed it at the one on Weiss' back. Unfortunately, just as when they made to move towards her, the Kamaitachi revealed itself once again. Just before he could squeeze the trigger, it leapt out of a nearby tree and sank its teeth into his arm, the force dragging the man to the side. Seeing it as an opportunity, as Blake and Yang spun around to attack it, Ruby activated her semblance and rushed over to Weiss. Unfortunately, before she was even halfway, a blur of black and a white zipped past her. Stabbing one of its legs into the ground, it spun in a circle like a top and sent blades of grass and weeds everywhere. Unable to see properly but sensing something ahead of her, she stopped and carved her side upwards, the smooth metal blade gliding against bone, before feeling a heavy body slam into her chest and tackle her to the floor, crescent rose slipping from her hand. Her vision was a whir of black and white as the Kamaitachi trampled all over her, the razor-sharp tips of its legs slamming into her stomach and thighs, and gradually chipping away at her aura. It only lasted a few seconds though, and the weasel jumped away from her as Yang landed on the ground with a crash and made an attempt to grab the slippery Grimm, only for it to disappear back into the brush.
Guys?
Weiss' voice came frantic from a short distance away.
It's too fast, and it keeps hiding,
Ruby called, picking up her weapon as Yang pulled her back to her feet.
Blake, can you dash? On it,
Blake said with a nod. Taking a step back, the girl sheathed her sword and closed her eyes. Opening them again, she twisted in place and fell to a knee while tearing the weapon back into 2 parts. Jumping over the large wave of purple energy as it tore through the grass, Ruby landed next to the girl and was happy to see that it had worked. While it was still ankle-high, the grass was no longer obscuring their vision, and they all had a clear view of the Kamaitachi using its legs to slash away at the heiress. Upon seeing that its cover had been blown, however, it turned to look at them, and let out a noise that was halfway between a scream and a bark and charged at them. But with full sight lines and nowhere for it to hide, they were ready. Stepping in front of her team, Ruby shifted her hold on Crescent Rose and slammed her foot into the back of her side's head to kickstart its momentum, but kept her strikes low. As she deflected blows from the creature's bladed limbs, she felt Yang jump over her head and land on the other side of it, with Blake darted around to the side and made a beeline for Weiss. Seeing that, the Grim tried to pull away again and dart after her, but Saber dashed in to intercept, his scimitar turning into a Naginata and gliding smoothly through the air, forcing the creature to jump back to avoid him.
Get Weiss free and handle that one,
Ruby called to Blake as the trapped Grim continued to bark at them.
We have this.
With peace of mind at knowing Blake would not let her down, Ruby reared her side back and prepared to attack. Pulling the trigger, she blasted off and brought her side up where its head would have been. At the same time, Yang pushed herself off with a shot from her gauntlets. Proving to be as agile as she suspected, the creature twisted its body out of the way of the blade and raised its tail to be flat against its back, the mass of fur dampening the Yang's monstrous blow that would absolutely have shattered its spine, but instead sent it crashing into the floor. The second it landed, its arm slashing out and slid across their ankles, sending pain up Ruby's body despite her aura. Before it could attack again, a loud gunshot from Saber's flintlock tore through the silent forest, and the bullet flew between the both of them and struck the floor and exploded in a cloud of purple that launched the Grim into the air. Seeing an opportunity, but not in the right position to capitalize on it, Ruby twirled her scythe and slammed the blunt end into the creature's side to send it tumbling through the air into Yang's waiting arms, where she knew it would meet its end. Sure enough, though it tried its best to wriggle free by stabbing at the blonde's eyes, she simply turned her head away and wrapped her fingers around its thin body.
Arg!
She grunted and tore the Kamaitachi in half, dropping each side to the ground without a second glance.
Stupid thing!
With theirs taken care of, Ruby looked towards Weiss and prepared to rush in to help if needed. Thankfully it wasn't, and they were just in time to see Blake decapitate the other as it struggled to free itself from the block of ice it had been encased in. Laying on the ground, free of its grasp, was Weiss, her arm raised and the bracelet on her wrist shining a bright white.
Are you okay?
Ruby asked, rushing in and offering a hand to her partner.
I'm fine,
the heiress breathed, accepting the help and brushing off her skirt.
You sure took your time though. Sorry,
she apologized and pulled out her scroll.
You should probably stay between us till we get to the tower. You're on orange. Yeah.
The girl groaned, massaging the back of her neck and moving to stand between Blake and Yang.
I am definitely not going to be the one climbing it though. Fine, why?
Dumping herself down onto a large slab of concrete the size of her body, Ruby laid back and let out a long sigh. What was supposed to have been barely an hour's walk to the tower had turned into 2 hours of them fighting their way through the forest of Kamaitachi. After every pair they fought, another pair would show up a couple of minutes later and try to cage one of them. Fortunately, after the second pair they were used to it and prepared for them, but that didn't mean taking on 2 extremely fast and agile Grim wasn't tiring. It also didn't help that an Ursa had shown up during one of those fights and made everything so much more complicated. Eventually they had broken through though, and finally emerged from the woods and into a large clearing filled with debris. Large slabs of chiseled rock littered the area, even the smallest of which was taller than her, while the biggest was easily around 15 feet high. Along the left side was a withered stone wall that was almost double the height of the largest rock, and in the center of everything was a massive tower that expanded well beyond the treeline. If she wasn't mistaken, the ruins they were sat amongst had likely been a castle at one time in the past. How long in the past, she had no idea, but given that most of the debris was sticking out of the ground, she felt it had to at least be a few thousand years for the planet to have swallowed so much of it. But she couldn't help but wonder how such a thing had even been made that long ago. The maneuvering of such massive pieces of stone would be difficult even by present-day standards, but the still-standing wall showed that the castle was likely made entirely of them. And if those people had made such a mountainous structure, how had they ever fallen to Grim that were likely weaker than the Grim of present day? If they had failed to hold out, how long could Vale or the other kingdoms survive?
So which one of us is climbing that thing?
Blake asked, seating herself on the edge of the rock.
Not me,
Weiss and Yang replied immediately, the former sitting down on a glyph while the other sprawled out on the floor like a starfish.
Allah!
Saber looking up at the massive tower of stone.
I'll keep watch down here. Guess I'll go then.
Ruby groaned and pushed herself up onto her elbows to look at her girlfriend.
Wanna join me?
Sure, Blake said with a small smile, standing up and offering out a hand. Happily taking it, she hopped to her feet and stood beside her girlfriend.
We'll be back soon.
Receiving nothing but dismissive waves from her best friend and sister, they turned away and pushed themselves through the heavy iron door at the base of the tower into a large room. Just like outside, it was littered with broken stone and destroyed bookcases. Littering the floor were what looked to be metal book bindings, their wrappings and pages long since disintegrated. The only thing in the room that seemed to have actually survived the test of time was a single banner on the opposite wall. On its face was what looked to be a kingdom's insignia, a large staff with a circular top, inside of which was a sideways eye. It was definitely not one she had ever seen in the school's textbook, but something about it felt familiar.
Isn't that the same eye that was on the ruins in Patch?
Blake remarked, pointing at the insignia.
The window was shaped the same.
Looking closer at the banner, Ruby noticed that Blake had a point.
Huh, it is. Weird. Oh well.
She walked over to what looked to be a broken staircase and glanced up to see a hole.
Wanna give me a lift? MMM?
Blake hummed and pulled her eyes away from the banner.
Oh yeah.
Placing her foot in Blake's hand, she pushed herself off and reached up to grab the edge of the hole. Once she was through, she turned around and reached down to help her teammate up.
Thanks.
Blake grunted as she stood up, her amber eyes gleaming in the dark as she looked down on her.
No problem.
Ruby smiled. With the staircase being rather narrow, the two of them were pressed tightly against each other to fit, and despite the fact they were in the middle of a mission, Ruby couldn't help but blush a little. Wanting to at least indulge in a little bit of privacy, she reached up on her toes and pressed her lips against Blake's for a few seconds, happy to feel Blake respond in kind.
You should lead the way.
Ruby grinned as their lips parted.
I need to save my battery life. MHM.
Blake hummed in a suspicious, yet humorous tone.
I'm sure that's the only reason you want me to go in front. WH what?
Ruby blushed as her girlfriend started climbing the stairs.
I can't see, remember? Likely story.
The girl chuckled.
Ack. Just go.
She blustered, gliding her fingers along the wall to keep her balance as she climbed. They climbed in silence for a few minutes, making sure to take slow steps as they were uncertain as to the stability of the staircase. Every now and then, Ruby would feel pebbles underneath her boots and Blake would call out a crumbled step, causing her to hop over a gap. At one point, she even had to boost Blake up to another level due to how much it crumbled away.
So?
Ruby grunted, pulling herself up with some help from her girlfriend.
Are you still nervous about seeing your parents?
She paused and shook her head.
Sorry. Stupid question. Of course you are. Ignore me. It's fine,
the girl said in a quiet voice.
I am, but I'm more scared at the minute. What if we find the group and they are dash? They're not,
Ruby said with as force as she could muster.
Saber said they have his best fighters with him. And you said it yourself. Anything can happen.
The girl let out a sad sigh.
I'm just preparing myself for all possibilities. That's fair.
Ruby could hardly deny her that. Though she wanted to make sure Blake stayed hopeful, she knew it would be wrong of her to make the girl expect an outcome that might not happen. After all, while she was choosing to stay optimistic about finding her girlfriend's parents, it was true that anything could happen, especially outside of the kingdoms.
Just promise me you won't give up hope. You're at my side,
Blake said with fondness in her tone.
I couldn't even if I wanted to. That's right.
She grinned despite not knowing whether Blake was looking or not.
And that's why I'm the best girlfriend ever. I'll definitely fight anyone who says otherwise,
Blake mumbled. Ruby giggled slightly as she finally spotted light up ahead and the stairway began to widen. She had sorely missed Blake's flirting over the last few days during their argument, so for the girl to be teasing her was a huge relief. Eventually, though, the staircase came to an end and they were greeted by an archway, the large metal door that had previously slotted into it lying on the floor in front of it. While it wasn't as spacious as the one below, it definitely seemed like it had once served as a lookout point of sorts. Despite most being destroyed, there were a few spindly wooden frames, one of which still held a solitary rusted spear that would likely crumble to dust if she even touched the blade.
"How do you think this kingdom fell?"
she asked, still curious as to what had happened to it.
"It seems like they knew what they were doing to build all this." "Not hard to guess."
Blake shrugged and walked over to one of the large gaps in the wall that served as a window.
"The same things humanity keeps failing to learn from." "What do you mean?"
Ruby asked, walking to another that was a few feet away.
"War and Grimm,"
Blake said with a shake of her head.
"Despite having a common enemy we should be united against, people always chose to fight each other instead. Wars over land were common in the past, especially around the time this castle was likely made, and wars always bring Grimm. And yet, instead of learning from that, we're still doing it. The four kingdoms are separated by more than borders, and even humanity is separated into humans and faunus, both fighting each other instead of working together."
She let out a sad breath and looked down.
"Even me, the daughter of someone who always preached peace, fell into violence. With how easy we fall into old habits, I sometimes wonder if humans and faunus are just destined to destroy themselves."
Looking over at the girl who was resting on her elbows, Ruby knew she couldn't deny there was some validity to her points. After all, it had only been less than 80 years since the Great War, and less than 60 years since the Faunus Wars. Just as Blake said, people still fought, but that's not all they did.
"I don't think we are."
She smiled at her girlfriend.
"You're right about us fighting each other. I wish we didn't, but we do. But then, we always find our way back to peace, and our bond grows stronger because of it. I mean, just look at us right now. Human and faunus working together on a mission to save your parents, who are on their way to Vale to talk about, peace stuff with the council."
Despite the topic, Blake gave a short chuckle at how little she knew about what the meetings were actually about.
"The war might not have been good for people, but faunus now have more rights than they've ever had. And while I know it's not perfect and more still needs to be done, it's progress." "Right."
Blake fell silent for a second, clearly thinking about what Ruby had just said. Letting her girlfriend think it through in silence, she leaned forward and looked at the surrounding area. Though most of it was just trees and hills, she was very happy to spot what definitely looked like a river a few miles from their position. Excitedly, she pulled a pair of binoculars that Weiss had brought from Zealand out of her rucksack and zoomed in on the area, a wide smile pulling at her lips.
"You really are just full of hope, aren't you?"
Blake said in a quiet voice.
"Yup."
Ruby grinned happily, pushing herself away from the wall and handing the binoculars to the raven-haired girl.
"Because being hopeful usually pays off."
As the girl accepted them, Ruby pointed out in the direction she had been looking and awaited the reaction. She didn't have to wait long before the girl let out a strangled chuckle filled with nothing but pure relief.
"Smoke,"
she whispered.
"White smoke."
Ruby grinned.
"A campfire by the river. Just like you said."
Blake pulled the binoculars away from her face, and Ruby saw a single tear fall down the girl's cheek. Thankfully, Ruby knew it was a happy one from the smile on the face, and held her hand out to accept the device back. However, much to her surprise, she instead found herself pulled forward, and lips pressed against her own. It wasn't heated in any way. There was no tongue, or even movement, but the passion behind it caused Ruby's heart to race as she allowed herself to sink into her girlfriend's body. Unfortunately, as much as she wished that kiss in particular could have lasted forever, Blake pulled away a few seconds later and looked down on her with something in her eyes that Ruby had never seen before. Something she could quite place. Blake paused, the hand on her bank balling into a fist for a second. She looked like she was about to say something, but after a blink and a small shake of her head, whatever had been in her eyes vanished.
"Thank you for holding on to hope when I can't." "You don't have to thank me for that,"
she replied with a happy smile, wondering what Blake had been about to say.
"Now!"
She pulled away and took out her scroll to check the compass.
"Let's get to your parents."
Chapter 53, Under Attack. If there was one thing Ruby could say with absolute certainty, it was that she was incredibly tired of her mouth being filled with the taste of grass. It wasn't simply enough that just walking through the overgrown forest meant that it was common for a stray blade of grass to be kicked and work its way into her mouth. But with the frequency of grim attacks and hits being taken, she often found herself on the ground with a mouthful of the horrid-tasting greenery. And this attack was no different. After taking a rather brutal hit from a grim, she had once again found herself sliding along the floor and spitting out the greenery as she looked up at the berserker that stood before her. Being a variant of the Ursa, the beast looked similar in many aspects. Both had bulky frames, armored heads with Ursidae features, and a thick layer of fur. But the berserkers had a few notable differences. The first, and most obvious, was the fact that it was bipedal instead of quadrupedal. Instead of walking on all fours and attempting to crush people with its weight and slash them apart with their claws like Ursi, berserkers walked on two hind legs and used their arms to land devastatingly powerful punches with their bulbous, armored fists that had grown to resemble boxing gloves. The second notable thing about them was that their backs were no longer covered in the same spikes as its cousins. Instead, what looked like a craggy trail of rock stretched from the base of its skull, covering its back and arms, making it almost impervious to sneak attacks. All of those things unfortunately made the beast stronger and faster than regular Ursi, and though RWBY had hoped to avoid encountering one by cutting through the woods instead of taking the west road, it seemed a few had wandered away and stumbled into their path. Unfortunately, as night had already begun to fall, they hadn't seen them until it was too late. Arf! The ear-splitting roar brought RWBY attention back to hers, and Weiss berserker just in time to see it raise one of its huge arms and send it screaming at her so fast that it became a blur of black and white. Fortunately, RWBY was faster and pushed herself out of the way as the fist slammed into the floor, sending dirt and broken shards of stone everywhere. Landing beside her partner, she put a few shots into the beast's side. "You good?" RWBY asked her partner, who had already been punched through a tree by the Grim. "Yes." She groaned and sent a stream of white spears towards the creature's fist, each one turning to ice as it slammed into the ground. "I'll be better when this thing is dead, though." "Then let's get it over with." RWBY smiled at her friend. "Ready for ping pong?" Still a stupid name, but yes. Deciding not to waste time correcting the heiress on just how perfect a name it was for the attack, RWBY grinned and positioned her side behind her and fired off a shot to propel herself forward. At the same time, Weiss ignited a red glyph at her own feet and followed suit. Hearing the sounds of cracking ice as they approached, both jumped aside in time to dodge a spinning right hook from the berserker, and landing on a glyph either side of the beast, they began their attack. Using their mobility to their advantage, they jumped from glyph to glyph. With each passing, they would take it in turns to land minor hits before once again ducking out just in time to avoid getting pummeled by its heavy fists. While the beast was quicker than Ursi, their speed was still too much for it. Unable to hit them, it began to swing wildly, its large fists shattering glyphs only for more to be made in their place. But RWBY knew it was already too late for it. Whatever intelligence it had once held due to its evolution was now gone, and all that remained was a mindless beast flailing in desperation. And that was all she needed to be able to predict its movements. And after a couple of seconds, she found her opening. "Stinger!" she called. As it brought its arm down to smash through another glyph, RWBY gathered power around her legs and activated her semblance. Careening towards the beast, she twisted her side into position so that the fangs jammed into the crack between the armor on its arm and the bulbous bone glove. Firing off a shot to boost her speed as she knew it would try to resist, she landed on the ground and reached up to seize the bolt as she tugged with all her might while letting out a guttural groan. With the combination of her semblance, the boosting shot, and her natural strength, the huge fist was torn clean from the berserker's arm, though not before the Grim was pulled from its feet and thrown through the air towards a large rock. Before he could even slam into it, though, Weiss rushed past her, yellow energy crackling around her, while the etchings of her rapier shined a bright white. RWBY watched as wind erupted from the back of the heiress' rapier and reacted with the lightning dust. In what felt like a millisecond, the girl shot forward faster than lightning ever could, and in the next, she was knelt on the other side of the Grim. The only evidence that remained of any attack being executed was the small hole that had been drilled through the beast's chest, which quickly began to expand, turning the berserker to smoke before it could even hit the ground. As the beast faded from view, RWBY saw her partner attempt to get to her feet, only to lose her balance as the time dilation wore off. Rushing over, she caught the girl just in time and held her up. "You okay?" she asked again, slightly worried. "Too much dust." The girl breathed quietly, slumping against her side. "Need a break." Pulling out her scroll, she checked their aura meters and saw that the girl was almost in the red. Despite possibly being the strongest on the team, though Yang would argue differently, Weiss' stamina had always been an issue, and with them having been constantly assaulted by Grim throughout the day, it wasn't surprising that the girl was exhausted. In fact, What was surprising was that she had held out as long as she had. So knowing the girl needed a break before her aura drained completely, she gave a nod and looked to the side. Thankfully, Saber had already finished off his berserker and was running to help Yang and Blake.
All right,
Ruby agreed, helping the girl away from the battle and placing her down against a large tree.
I haven't seen you overcharge in a while. I needed to kill it.
Weiss groaned as she leaned against a tree.
A regular charge wouldn't have gone through. Besides, I need to get better at handling that. In the middle of a fight probably isn't the best time to practice that.
Ruby chuckled, sitting down beside her best friend.
Especially not when you're already low on aura.
The girl gave an uncaring shrug and pulled a drink from her pouch.
You gave me an order, I followed it. I can give wrong orders,
Ruby countered as the heiress gulped down the water.
and I like when you all call me on them. And I shall do exactly that should you ever give me one,
Weiss said firmly once she was done with her drink.
Sorry. First actual mission here. Kinda nervous, you know. Well, you are doing fine.
Feeling a comforting warmth rush up her arm, as Weiss grasped her wrist reassuringly, Ruby gave the girl a grateful smile.
So how far are we from the river?
Pulling out the map from her own pouch and setting it on the ground, using her torch to illuminate it. Bringing up the compass on which she had marked the smoke's location, she pressed it against the map and quickly marked the clearing she was confident they were at. Thankfully, if she was correct, the river was not too far from their current position.
Less than an hour,
she replied.
maybe more, depending on how many Grimm we see. Then we just need to follow the river down to where the smoke was. Good,
A male voice said, appearing from the tree line with Blake and Yang in tow.
with any luck, we'll reach them before we lose all light. I doubt it,
Yang replied and stretched her arms above her head.
Night falls fast on Sanus due to the mountains. We have about 30 minutes left till we can't see.
Ruby nodded in agreement.
Maybe we should camp here for the night? Weiss is tired and needs to gather her SD dash. I'm good to continue,
Weiss replied, pushing herself to her feet.
Are you sure? Yes,
The heiress said and looked towards Blake.
if we are fast, then we can get to your parents tonight. Ensure that they are safe, and then get some rest in a more secure location. All right then.
She accepted her sister's hand and let herself be pulled to her feet.
Any objections?
Just as she'd expected from Yang, the woman gave a thumbs up and a wide grin while Blake simply gave a reserved nod. Though the girl was still rather quiet, she had seemed a little brighter since their talk in the tower.
Okay,
Saber said, picking up the map and observing it.
if we go over this hill instead of around it, we can save maybe 20 minutes. But it's a steep climb. We can handle a steep climb,
The ninja hummed.
A higher vantage point will also help prevent us from going off course too. Then that's what we'll do.
The man said shortly, handing the map back.
Let's go! Right behind you, dude.
Yang confirmed, though threw him a disapproving look as he walked off.
He's just doing his job.
Ruby smiled up at her. Rolling her eyes, Yang threw an arm around her shoulder, and they all took off after him.
He could be less of a dick about it though,
She grumbled.
That's fair.
She chuckled, unable to deny that his disposition definitely left a little to be desired. Letting out a low breath as she reached down to grab an exposed root to keep herself from falling, Ruby took a second to catch her breath. Looking down at her teammates, she saw that both Weiss and Blake had decided against climbing the hill itself and settled for jumping from glyph to glyph instead. She couldn't blame them though. After all, the hill was far steeper than any of them had thought it would be. In fact, to call it a hill would be rather generous. Where most hills had steady inclines, this one was almost a 90-degree angle, causing them to do more scaling of its face than walking. Thankfully, due to having decent arm strength due to wielding a heavy scythe, she wasn't having much difficulty, and they were definitely still making good time. Unfortunately, night was falling fast, and without the ambient light of the city, it was becoming almost impossible to see very far. However, she didn't need light to see her girlfriend since the girl's amber eyes shone in the darkness. So reaching out as Blake appeared just below her, she took the girl's hand and pulled her up to her level, wrapping an arm around her waist to keep her steady.
Almost to the top.
She smiled at her.
MHM.
The faunus breathed.
I'm definitely considering just rolling down the other side. I'll join you on that one.
Yang groaned as she passed.
Climb the hill, he said. It'll be quick, he said. Quick, my food dash. Faster than going around.
Blake cut her off, a slight hint of humor in her voice.
And we haven't seen any Grimm in a while.
It was true. Though the Grimm had previously barely allowed them 15 minutes to breath, they had become oddly sparse in the last 30 minutes. With the exception of the occasional Nevermore flying overhead, not a single one had been seen on the way to the hill, nor as they'd been climbing it. It was a little disconcerting, but Ruby supposed she was simply growing used to the constant attacks.
I guess we're just getting lucky,
Ruby hummed.
We should keep going though. MHM,
Blake replied, her weight shifting off the arm as she hopped across to a glyph that appeared beside them before springing up to the next one above.
See you at the top.
Grinning up at the raven-haired girl, Ruby gave her a competitive nod before continuing to pull herself up the steep hill. Finally, after 5 more minutes, she finally reached the top and collapsed onto her back. While she had definitely done more strenuous exercise in the past, the long day before the climb was enough to make her arms feel like jelly. Nevertheless, she still turned onto her front after a couple of seconds and reached out over the edge to pull her partner up.
I really need to work on mobile glyphs,
the heiress panted, falling to her knees the moment she was pulled up.
Or just work on your arm strength,
Yang suggested with a hearty chuckle.
Says the one who was complaining about the climb 5 minutes ago,
Blake pointed out.
I may have complained, but I would also like to point out that I'm the only one still standing. Yes, yes,
Ruby replied with a wave of her tired arm.
You're very strong.
Sitting up and activating her semblance to dull most of the aching, Ruby threw a quick acting energy bar at the woman to shut her up before pulling one out for herself and her other teammates. Enjoying the feeling of just eating something and feeling her energy return with each bite, she stood up with a groan and pulled out her scythe, walking to stand next to Saber, who was looking out over the treetop from the other side of the hill. Realizing she hadn't seen the man eat, or even take a break, all day, she dug into her pocket and handed him her last energy bar.
Thanks,
he grumbled, accepting the food and tearing it open to take a bite.
It's a straight shot to the river from here.
Despite him pointing towards it, Ruby couldn't see anything in the vast expanse of darkness. So lifting her sniper up, she popped out her 4x scope and activated the night vision mode. Sure enough, just as Saber said, she spotted the river only a short distance from the base of the hill hidden amongst some trees.
Nice spot,
she smiled, lowering her weapon again.
It must be so cool to have night vision. It comes in handy,
he shrugged, though cast her a sideways glance.
As does my stronger hearing.
Ruby blushed a little at the knowing tone in his voice. Since he did have ears like Blake, she hadn't suspected that he had enhanced hearing.
Your sister doesn't like me,
he said matter-of-factly.
That's just Yang.
Ruby scratched the back of her head awkwardly.
But you did insult our friend when we first met, and you are a little impatient. So?
She trailed off as the man looked away from her and returned to scanning the treetops.
I have reasons to not trust Shnees,
he said simply.
And I am impatient because I want to save my chieftain. And instead of sending me professionals, the Vale Council sent me a team of first years who tire themselves out too quickly.
Though it hadn't been said in the kindest of way, Ruby could hardly deny that it was the truth. It was a truth that even she had realized when fighting alongside Velvet at the funeral. Despite being the best team in their year, they were nowhere near the level of the second years, like Team CFUI, and even further from the third and fourth years. So to a professional like Saber, who was commanding the guards of an entire island, it was understandable why having first years slowing him down instead of someone who could keep up with him.
Sorry,
she mumbled, since it was their idea to come themselves instead of sending Team CFUI or Xanthia's team. To her surprise, the man let out a loud sigh and took another bite of the energy bar.
Don't be,
he said with a shake of his head.
It's good you want to help, but you need to learn how to pace yourselves better. Not every Grimm needs your biggest moves.
It was another thing Ruby couldn't deny.
Thanks for the Advi dash.
She was cut off as he held up his hand and stepped forward to peer out into the darkness. Though she couldn't see anything, she joined him and tried to look for what he was trying to see.
What is your scope?
He asked abruptly.
Adjustable up to 20 times. Why? I saw something over there,
he said and pointed to the distance.
But my night sight isn't good enough. Oh, sure.
Adjusting the range on her scope, she raised her sniper again and looked out into the distance. For almost a minute everything seemed normal and quiet, but then she saw what Saber had likely glimpsed. A single, red flash sparked in the darkness from between the trees, quickly followed by a yellow and purple one. They were tiny even with the zoom, little more than specks in the distance, but she knew they were gunshots. And the longer she watched, the more frequent they became.
They're under attack.
She breathed quickly and lowered her weapon.
We have to go. Now!
Saber said and began to walk to the edge.
Get your team and catch up. I'll go ahead.
Returning her scythe to her back as the man disappeared into the darkness again, she rushed back over to her team and pulled the backpack from her shoulders, quickly extracting the flashlights and handing them to Blake and Yang.
What's happening?
Yang asked, the smile of whatever conversation had been happening fading from her face.
We saw gunshots in the distance.
Their reaction was instant, and all three of them stood up and began to correct their own backpacks.
Weiss, are you able to run? If that's what you need,
she confirmed as she picked up her rucksack. Shaking her head, Ruby pointed to the bag and then to Yang.
Good. Me and you are the fastest, so we'll go ahead. Leave your pack with Yang so we aren't slowed down. You two can bring up the rear. Then why give us the torches?
Blake asked quickly.
Weiss can use a summon to give us a little light.
In an instant, Allie the Beowulf appeared between them and spread its soft white light across the hilltop. Looking at her partner, she saw the girl's rapier was drawn and ready for anything they might encounter, and gave the girl a nod before returning her gaze to her girlfriend and sister.
Be safe and stay on comms,
the fauness said, giving her a kiss on the cheek.
We'll be right behind you. I will,
she smiled briefly.
And we'll keep your parents safe as well. You two look after each other too. Always.
Yang nodded, cracking her knuckles to show she was ready to fight.
Good.
She looked back to her partner.
Let's go!
Pulling her sword free as she left the cave, the fauness looked around the clearing and took in the horrifying sight that greeted her. Only 20 minutes ago, the small clearing beside the lake had been serene and peaceful, filled with tents and sleeping bags, people laughing and talking in high spirits as they ate fish stew by the campfire. But then the Grim had arrived. Stampeding out of the trees and the river, all manner of beasts came crashing into the clearing, sending everyone running into the cave for safety while the guards fought to protect them. But that wasn't her. She hated sitting back and letting others protect her, being forced to listen to the constant popping on gunfire and shouting of orders. So after making sure that the people they had picked up were safe and secure in the cave, she had turned back to join the fight. In the few minutes she had been inside though, even more Grim had joined the fight. Beowulfs, Ursai, creeps, Grednals, wisps, croakers, even griffins circled the sky above them. Multicolored flashes filled her vision, and loud bangs assaulted her ears as the guards tried their hardest to stem the tide, and the smell of dust clung to the air around them so strong that she tasted the bitterness in the back of her throat. Nevertheless, blocking out the taste and preparing herself to fight, she rushed into the fray in search of Gyra. As expected though, it was long before she felt the hair on her neck prickle slightly, and spun around to lash out with her weapon, the tip of the blade sinking into the soft flesh of a Beowulf cub and turning it to smoke in seconds. Continuing to fight through the sea of monsters, she finally saw the huge panther faunus in the distance and made her way towards him.
Gyra!
She called over the gunfire when she finally made it to his side, chopping the head off a creep that was approaching from behind.
Callie wants you back inside.
No, he replied adamantly, catching a wisp by the throat and crushing it with his bare hands.
I will not leave my people to fight alone. Well, can't say I didn't try.
She smiled to herself. She'd expected that result when the guards had asked her to bring him back. In truth, the only reason she had agreed to try was to get out of there herself. So, not bothering to waste time on what she knew to be a fruitless effort, she turned her back to him and settled in to helping the menagerie guard fight the horde. Unfortunately, after what felt like another half an hour of fighting, it was quickly becoming clear that they may have bitten off more than they could chew. For every Grim they killed, 3 more would join the fight, and while the menagerie guards were strong, they were slowly getting outnumbered. To the right of the clearing, she saw Sienna take a heavy hit from an Ursa that caused her aura to flicker and retreat backwards while others covered for her. The left was very much the same, and even her own breathing was becoming shallow and ragged as the endless horde continued to swarm them.
Sir, you have to retreat,
one of the guards nearby called, blocking a croaker's spiked tongue with his sword.
We'll cover you. This is the most fortifiable position for miles around,
Gyra replied.
If we go anywhere else, then we leave ourselves exposed. Better exposed than dead.
A female guard shouted over her own gunfire.
The people need a chieftain who is alive to guide them, not one who died to protect them.
Begrudgingly, she had to agree with the guard.
She's right, Gyra. We have Gyra.
Distracted by the conversation, none of them had seen the alpha Beowulf that leapt from the treeline. The great, snarling beast slammed its forepaws into Gyra's chest, and though he tried to remain firm, it pushed itself off and sent him tumbling out of sight. Raising her sword and rushing to help, the beast barely paid her rapier any mind as it used its large paw to smack her aside, her sword slipping from her grip and rolling away. Though she was confident in her abilities against lesser grim, older ones such as alphas were things she generally tried to avoid, but there was no avoiding this one. Low on aura and weaponless, all she could do was push herself backwards and search frantically for her weapon, as the beast walked slowly towards her. With each step it took, and every desperate grasp of her hand that was met with empty air, she felt fear begin to rise within her at the realization that there was nothing she could do against the Beowulf.
Help!
She shouted weakly to the surrounding guard. Unfortunately, she received no reply. Grim were still flooding into the area, and everyone was busy fighting for their own lives. There was no help, there was no one to save her, and as the beast readied its back legs to pounce at her, she couldn't even muster the will to scream at what was surely death. But it wasn't. As the pitch-black monstrosity leapt into the area around them was suddenly bathed in a soft white glow, the source of which confused her beyond belief. A shining white alpha Beowulf, like nothing she had ever seen in her life, slammed into the beast's side and wrestled it to the floor in a mess of snarls and gnashing teeth. Eventually, though, the gleaming white wolf won, its jaw clamping around the neck of the dark wolf and biting down hard, smoke seeping from the side as the grim began to disintegrate.
Good girl, Allie,
a voice called from behind her. Turning around, she saw a girl sprint from the treeline. Clad in red and black and holding a vicious-looking scythe, the new girl launched herself at a group of nearby grim and dispatched them with such speed that she knew instantly that the girl was a huntress. Given her age, though, she likely wasn't a fully trained one, but that didn't stop her from immediately tearing through an Ursa like it was nothing more than paper as she made her way over. In seconds, she was standing directly in front of her, her silver eyes gleaming in the darkness, and a confident smile on her face.
Are you okay?
She asked hurriedly, offering a hand out.
She
wasn't sure.
There was a white Beowulf.
She knew it probably sounded stupid, but with so many things happening at once, her mind seemed to latch onto the most confusing thing first in order to make sense of it all.
Oh, that was Weiss,
the girl replied, her smile widening and only serving to make her soft features even prettier.
I think she has your weapon too.
Seeing the girl nod to the side, she turned her head and saw the bright beast stood defensively at her side, with lightning lash in its mouth. Before she could even reach out and take it, though, its head turned towards a nearby group of guards that were under assault by Borbatusks and let out a low growl, dropping the spiraled rapier and taking off towards them. Shaking her head disbelievingly as it snatched up one of the horrid pigs and shook it like a play toy, she picked up her weapon and accepted the girl's waiting hand, letting herself be pulled to her feet.
Thanks.
No problem, the huntress said earnestly and raised her hand to her ear.
Weiss, where are you?
She couldn't hear whatever the other person on the line said, but the red-headed girl in front of her gave a small nod and looked over to the Beowulf, which had already finished dispatching of the Borbatusks.
All right, Allie's done on the ground, so take care of the griffins.
At the girl's command, the Beowulf vanished into mist, and she lowered her hand.
You can go to safety now if you want. We've got this.
Giving a shake of her head, she pressed the trigger and activated the lightning dust in her rapier.
I can still fight. All right.
The huntress smiled.
Keep the smaller grim off our backs, and we'll protect you from the bigger ones.
After giving her an understanding nod to the girl, the redhead raised her scythe and charged at a nearby Ursa, effortlessly dancing around its attacks and dispatching it in seconds. However, as much as she wanted to stand and watch the Reaper fight some more, she spotted a small group of Beowulf cubs run out of the forest and moved to engage. Time was lost as she slashed away at whatever grim charged her way. It could have been 10 minutes, it could have been an hour, she didn't know. All she did know was that the horde was finally getting smaller, with the red-headed Reaper focusing on the larger grim and her friend, who had arrived in a storm of white spears, riding what looked to be a giant white lancer, taking care of any grim that tried to approach from the air. The menagerie guards were left to freely kill any lesser Grimm that tried to join the fight. At some point in the fight, their captain, Saber Redentia, had even showed up and resumed command immediately. Even Gyra had rejoined the fight with renewed energy, his claws out and tearing through croakers and sulfur fish like paper. They were finally pulling back from what looked like certain defeat, and hope was once again blooming in her chest. With any luck, the Grimm would be stopped before midnight, and she might actually get some rest. Unfortunately, all that hope didn't stop her from being tired. Her arms ached, and her legs screamed for her to take a break as she ducked under a croaker's long tongue, returning in kind by extending her rapier into its whip form, the tip drilling into one of the beast's eyes, causing it to pop and release a nasty black fluid. Unfortunately, she had intended the attack to kill, and since it didn't, the spiked tongue was quick to wrap around her legs and began to drag her towards its gaping maw. And that was when she saw it. Something she thought she would never see again. As she raised her weapon to try and cut the sticky appendage, a large beam of purple light flew past her vision and severed it for her. She knew that light, knew that move, and as if one instinct, her head snapped around to the direction it had come from. Stood in between two dying Grimm, her eyes shining and her hair so much darker than the night around her, was Blake Belladonna. Why was she there? Why was she back? Why was her heart still racing at the mere sight of her? And why was her teeth grinding in anger? Confusion immediately rushed through her, and she felt her body shifting between colors as her emotions battled for dominance. Hi, Ely Dash. Blake? A gruff voice said from behind her. The raven-haired fauness had clearly heard it too despite the gunfire, and her amber eyes widened, filling with conflict as she looked to the side. Almost immediately, they filled with tears, and Ilya saw Gyra's large form push past her and rush towards the girl. Despite the Grimm that still flooded the area, despite the gunfire and shouted, he swept the girl up in his massive arms. Though being a few feet away, Ilya heard the girl's weapons drop from her hands, gamble shrouds sparking as the blades clashed with each other and her arms wrapped around the man's back, the delicate fingers digging into the back of his jacket as they both collapsed to their knees.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.